Giant fans that have supported us for more than 30 years at Giant Stadium, for all those years in Yankee Stadium, and some of you even back to the Polo Grounds. This is for you. This is for you.
Listen to me. Okay, the rest of your life, man, nobody can ever tell you that you couldn't do it, because you did.
With the second pick in the 2018 NFL Draft, the New York Giants select Saquon Barkley, running back, Penn State.
Ladies and gentlemen, you are listening to the Giants Guys podcast, dedicated to New York Giants football. And welcome to another episode of the Giants Guys. This is John Fennelly. Before we get into dissecting Giants football, let me outline what we'll be doing on the podcast this season. This endeavor is geared towards shining a light on the hard-working men and women who cover the team for the alternative media sources. You've heard what the Daily News, the Post, the Times, Newsday, and all the other papers have to say about the team, but you rarely get the view of the independent bloggers and beat reporters. That's what we're going to bring you. Each episode will feature at least one blogger or journalist from the Giants blogosphere to feature their work and allow them to give their take on what's happening in the land of the Giants. We'll also be running a series of historical shows that feature great and not so great moments from the Giants' 9-decade existence. I will tap into authors, columnists, NFL historians, and others to bring you back in time to analyze and relive those memorable moments, people, and teams. So sit back and enjoy the Giants Guys. Today's featured guest on the Giants Guys is Dan Schneier. He's from 24/7 Sports, which is owned and operated by CBS Interactive. Now, that's a massive network of websites across the basketball and football realm covering both pro and college teams. They also have a comprehensive college recruiting apparatus for both sports. They've been around for a long time. They recently went into a partnership with Pro Football Focus, and last year they annexed Rivals.com, which has been a huge recruiting site for years. Dan runs the Giants page for 24/7, and if you click on there, you'll see he's a pretty busy young man. Although the site runs a bit under the radar for a mainstream entity, it won't be for long until they're a major player on the internet. Go on there now, 247sports.com/Giants, and you'll be able to read Dan's work. Well, we're here with Dan Schneier of 24/7 Sports. He covers the Giants. You have a full page, or I guess a full section in 24/7. You seem to be the only guy doing it right now, Dan, but that's fine. You're doing an excellent job, and how are you today?
I'm doing great, John. Happy to be here. Happy to talk in Giants football whenever I can.
Yeah, it's an amazing season so far for the Giants, even though they haven't put the pads on yet. There's been a lot of storylines, but we'll get to those. But let's talk about you for a little bit. Let me ask you something. How long have you been doing this, and how long have you been doing it for 24/7?
Yeah, John. So I actually started with 24/7 a little over 2 years ago, about 2.5 years. It's actually coming up on my third year with 24/7 Sports. And before that, I was working with Fox Sports for about 3.5 years, doing general NFL coverage, running their NFL team on that side. So kind of covering every team there. And basically, I got into this because I was working right out of college as in an advertising company, in a video advertising company. And I really didn't have much passion for the work I was doing. By the end of that experience, I was coming to work every day saying, oh, how the hell am I going to get through this day? So on the side, I started my own football blog. I've always been obsessed with the game of football. The X's and O's is what's really always been my passion when it comes to football. And it's been an obsessive following since I was probably 12 years old. So I started my own blog, and at the same time, I saw on Twitter Chris Wessling, who used to work for RotoWorld. Now he's working for NFL.com.
Yep.
And Wessling was looking at the time for somebody to run the social media for RotoWorld. He didn't say it all outright, but he tweeted something like, our social media really needs a boost. So I just emailed him out of the blue. I can do this. Listen, I've done this and this. Here's my blog. He gave me a chance. I leveraged that into a job writing fantasy football for Pro Football Focus, something I still do today and have been now for 5 or 6 years. And from that, I leveraged it into a job with Fox, and then recently into a job with 24/7. And technically, I guess we work for CBS Sports because we were bought 2.5 years ago by CBS Sports. And that's who pays me. That's where my paychecks come from. But that's kind of been my journey to where I'm at now.
Well, that's a very interesting background. I want to tell you about fantasy football before we go any further. I used to play fantasy football before the internet. So just think about that.
I love it. I love it. You and my dad both. My dad, actually, it's the same story, and that's how I got into it. My mom actually used to be the person who ran the stats for my dad's fantasy football league with his buddies before there was the internet, and she would send out weekly reports with the stats, and I've seen some of them because she has them saved in our family's house, and it's quite the awesome sight to see.
I think it was more fun then because you had to look up the stats. It was pretty interesting. Let me ask you this. Do you consider yourself more of a blogger, a reporter, or a journalist? I mean, where do you fit, in that dichotomy?
Yeah, no doubt, John. I think the best way I can describe myself is somewhere in between. I don't actually have a term for what I do because, we don't actually have access right now we don't have credentials fully for the New York Giants at 24/7 Sports. It's something we're working on. But at the same time, I can't really consider myself a blogger entirely because we're doing so much video now and podcasts for 24/7 Sports, daily videos, Facebook Lives at least twice a week, podcasts for 24/7 Sports called Giants Time. And, at the same time, I've also had the experience, and, I've had to work for these myself, but they're very rewarding experiences of interviewing a lot of players like Sterling Shepard, who I've built a little bit of a relationship with. I've interviewed him twice, Justin Tuck, a few other former Giants players and NFL players. So I would probably best describe myself as somewhere in between.
Yeah, that's basically where the new media is headed. I mean, you do have journalism background, journalism degree, or?
Oh, of course, yeah. I have a journalism degree from the University of Wisconsin-Madison.
There you go. So you're in the minority, and so am I. I mean, we're actual journalism guys who decided to take on new media jobs, and it's not that easy to do. I mean, you'll find that most of the people that are working in new media just started their own blogs and are winging it, and they don't really understand the tenets of journalism. So you get a chance to marry the two, and I think that's why your site is a very interesting one, and a lot of your articles are very well written. So let's get to the Giants. A lot of change since last season. Let me get your assessment on Gettleman, Shermer, and the new coaching staff.
Sure. So we'll start with Gettleman in the order you went there. And I would say that he was my number one hire for this team. And I did think the flashiness of somebody like Louis Riddick, who also interviewed for the job, was intriguing. But Gettleman is a guy who was with this franchise up until 2011 when he joined the Carolina Panthers. And he was a big factor in the Giants developing and finding offensive linemen like Sean O'Hara, David Deal in the 5th round, Richie Soyber, guys that really helped make the franchise what they were. And when he came into the Giants, he said straight up, I am going to go back to the 3 factors that made this franchise the team that they were in 2007 and 2008, which were their 2 best seasons, especially the 2008 season before the Plaxico Burress incident. And that's stopping the run, running the football, and protecting the passer, and rushing the passer actually was the 3rd one. So I do like, and he's, answered every question. He's responded to the promises he's made with every single offseason move he's made. First, he built the depth on special teams and free agency. He got big guys on the defensive line. Kareem Martin, 6'6", 280 pounds at outside linebacker, a guy who's going to set the edge in the run game. drafted two defensive linemen, drafted an offensive lineman in Will Hernandez, who will likely be a day one starter. He got the best left tackle on the free agent market in Nate Solder. And another guy in Patrick Omeme, who might surprise people because this could be a Dave Gettleman gem, a guy he found, targeted in free agency from the Jacksonville Jaguars, started all 16 games, all 18 games if you include the postseason with them last season. So I really like what he's done from that standpoint, and then kind of transitioning into the rest of the coaching staff, Pat Shurmur and his staff. Shurmur's a guy who I was targeting this offseason if the Giants didn't get Josh McDaniels, who admittedly was probably my first target. But at the same time, the issue always with McDaniels is that he wanted to also take control over the roster moves and kind of be a general manager, head coach like Bill Belichick is in New England. And that's just something the Giants were really never planning to do. That's not something they've ever done in this franchise's history. So besides McDaniels, I thought Shurmur was the best offensive mind on the market. And when you really ask me what the biggest issue with this Giants team under Ben McAdoo was, it was the lack of creativity in their offensive scheme. And just in general, them running an offensive scheme that, in my opinion, has proven to fail in the NFL, even with the Green Bay Packers, a team that really should have more than one Super Bowl with Aaron Rodgers as their quarterback. But I do believe their offensive scheme holds them back. And then you move on to offensive coordinator. Mike Shula was not my number one choice. But at the same time, I don't think he's going to have much of a role on this offense. Besides, the key thing which he can do is bring everything he brought into that Carolina Panthers offense last season with Christian McCaffrey, the first-round pick, and apply it to Saquon Barkley. And remember, McCaffrey led the NFL, all running backs in targets last season, and was third in receptions. So that's going to be something really interesting to watch with Shula. Then lastly, James Bettcher was definitely my favorite offseason decision, my favorite offseason hire, the defensive coordinator. Here's a guy who's coordinated a top 6 defense in Arizona for the last 3 seasons, a defense that has finished in the top 3 in blitz percentage for the last 3 seasons. And it's a new age style defense that focuses more on matchups and less on traditional schemes and traditional, commentary that most people think would go into a defense. So from that standpoint, I really do like what the Giants did this offseason.
Yeah, and you're not alone. I mean, a lot of people are giving the Giants rave reviews for their offseason moves, but then comes the draft where you get to pretty much build your team. And Gettleman said he wanted to get himself some football players, and I think he did that, although he only had 6 picks. I think he chose wisely. What do you think?
Yeah, no doubt. And it's not like I can change my opinion on this now or rewrite history. As everyone who's followed me on Twitter knows, I was strongly in the camp that they needed to draft a quarterback. I believe Josh Rosen will be the next great NFL quarterback, and they had a chance at him. Even if they didn't like him, I also really like Sam Darnold. I thought those two were in a tier of their own for their ability to see the field, throw with anticipation, and process defenses fast, and also throw the ball accurately, especially Josh Rosen. But they decided to pass on a quarterback, and that's a decision that won't impact them this year. It won't impact them next year. But 5 years down the line is when I said we will have to look back on this decision and see where we're at. But aside from the big decision at number 2 overall, because, again, Saquon Barkley was arguably the best player in this entire draft and the best running back I've seen enter the NFL since Adrian Peterson. The rest of the draft is what really impressed me about Gettleman. Roto-World's Josh Norris had Lorenzo Carter, the guy they got in the 3rd round at number 66 overall, as his 25th best player on the board. I had him at 28 on my big board that I do. I thought he was the best pick of the draft from a value standpoint. Here's a guy who's 6'6", 250 pounds, and ran a 4.50 unofficial 4.46. And here's a guy who dominated Notre Dame offensive tackle Mike McGlinchey, who was the number 9 overall pick in the draft. In their matchup, Georgia versus Notre Dame this past season, he hasn't fully reached his potential, but the upside for him is unbelievable. And then you get a guy like Will Hernandez, who was Pro Football Focus's 17th best player on their big board. Here's a guy who mostly every team had a first-round grade on, but the run at the end of the first round of this draft with the wide receivers and safeties and skill position players kind of dropped him, and he fell right into the Giants' lap there at 34. And then I really love what Gettleman did with his later picks, just building through the trenches. I talked about this in an article I did earlier, but it was really a complete 100% 180 on the Giants' draft philosophy under Gettleman. Reese is a guy who really only drafted 7 offensive linemen in the first 4 rounds out of 55 picks in his 11 drafts with the New York Giants. And offensive and defensive linemen. And then Gettleman kind of reversed that trend. So I really like what the Giants did in the draft. Time will tell if they made mistake. And if Sam Darnold and Josh Rosen turn into unbelievable NFL quarterbacks, that might be the case. But for now, for 2018, it was a phenomenal draft.
But you forgot to mention that they did draft a quarterback.
No doubt. And listen, Kyle Aletta is a guy who has limited game tape out there. And as people who follow me on Twitter know, what I like to do is break down the game tape on these quarterbacks. I like to watch every single snap from every single game. I did about 10 to 15 games for all the top guys. Didn't have a chance to do that with Aletta. I really was honed in on them taking one at 2. But after they drafted him, I had the chance to do it. I saw games versus William & Mary, Villanova, obviously his Senior Bowl where he was the MVP.
Yep.
Incredible performance. And then I dug deep and saw a couple games from 2015 when he ran an offense that is very similar to what Pat Shurmur will run. It was an offshoot of a Bill O'Brien offense with a lot of play action passing, bootlegs on the rollout, and he really impressed me with his ability to see the field, throw with anticipation, all of the things that I liked in Josh Rosen and Sam Darnold, Laletta has, except for that exceptional arm talent. And the only thing that worries me is in the Meadowlands, in January, during playoff football, something we saw with Ryan Fitzpatrick and the Jets that one season he led them close to the playoffs. Can that arm hold up? Can he get the ball in spots when the wind is whipping? And that's something that time will tell. But from every other standpoint, I really like Kyle Laletta.
Yeah, and he may be the jewel of this draft class, believe it or not, because there's a lot of coaches and ex-coaches who do, and Pat Shurmur is one of them, who do not hold arm strength in high regard. They don't think it's that important. They think that leadership, understanding and reading defenses, and timing on your passes, who cares if you have the zip? I mean, you see guys like E.J. Manuel that can throw a ball through a brick wall. I mean, it doesn't really matter sometimes. It's nice to have a good arm. And the Meadowlands, the new stadium, is not like the old stadium. It's a little more enclosed. There's less of a wind factor. They made sure of that when they constructed it. So it's not like the old Giant Stadium where the wind blows one way, one half, and the other way, the other half. The wind isn't really that much of a factor. I think that he's going to be one of the best picks that they've made. And, going up with competing with Davis Webb, who we know nothing about. We really don't. We haven't seen him in a game action because, of course, the Giants foolishly didn't put him in when they had the opportunity. They went with Geno Smith for some stupid reason. I have no idea why. No one does. It's just McAdoo, and that's why he's not here anymore. He was a bad hire, and he was a bad hire and a good fire. That's what I always say.
Yep.
They'll compete, and I think in 5 years, maybe one of those guys will be the guy. But in 5 years, you could draft another quarterback. I mean, you could just move up in the draft and get one. And that gets me to my next question for you about Eli Manning. I wrote an article today in USA Today about Eli Manning not being quite finished. What is your take?
Yeah, and that was actually an amazing article. I know we talked about this a little bit before we jumped on this podcast in our conversation together, but I think everyone should jump out there, get on Giants Wire where this article is featured. It was really a nice in-depth analysis of Eli Manning from John. And I'm with you. For me, with Manning, I did see some decline in his ability to process, not process the play, but it's hard to explain. He just looked a little more uncomfortable in the pocket than I've ever seen him last season. But again, it's hard to gauge how much of that was impacted by the play of his offensive line. His 3 best offensive linemen, Justin Pugh, Weston Richburg, and DJ Fluker, all ended the season on injured reserve. We're also talking about an offensive scheme that never changed. 90% of the time, before McAdoo was fired, they were in 11 personnel with 3 wide receivers, and they didn't stack the receivers, they didn't bunch the receivers. It was the same alignment on every play. So you look at that from a defensive standpoint, and you're thinking, okay, we know what to expect on every play, and we know we're not going to have to beat an offensive line that could protect Manning, and we know they're not going to run the ball very much because the Giants barely did that and barely ran play action under McAdoo. So when you come in and you change the offensive scheme and you give Manning the opportunity to get back to what he does best, which is the play action passing game, which is the deep intermediate routes, something that, we saw under Kevin Gilbride. And as much as Giants fans want to bash Kevin Gilbride, and yes, the later years weren't great, he still ran an offense that better fit Manning's skill set. I think that's what Pat Shurmur is going to do. Yesterday on WFAN radio, in an interview with Mike Francesa, Shurmur said, "I really think what I've done is, take everything I learned from the West Coast offense under Andy Reid, combine it with everything I learned from Chip Kelly when it comes to tempo and spread, and create an offense that is quarterback friendly." And I think that's going to really help Eli Manning in 2018.
Yeah, I agree. And, a new offensive line and a new running back, and Evan Ingram actually playing a split, like a flanker type of position rather than traditional tight end, gives the Giants a lot of weapons. I mean,
No doubt.
Teams are not going to be able to, stack the box. They're going to have to backpedal, and that's what they need to do, get the defense backpedaling. I think that's what they'll do this year, and that's why I wrote that article, because if I hear one more time that Eli Manning is in decline or he's finished, he was just depressed last year. He'd take the snap, go back 2 steps, see that nobody was open, and just spike the ball. He said, in disgust. He says, why should I take a hit? These guys aren't really trying to coach this team. Why should I continue trying to take hits? So it was a little crazy with him. What about the defense and special teams? I mean, we got new coordinators on both. Special teams, I think they needed. Tom Quinn was there quite a long time. They needed a fresh face. Thomas McGahee comes in. He was here before as an assistant, but what do you see? Special teams? The rules have obviously changed for kickoffs, but what do you see on defense and special teams happening this year when it comes to scheme?
Yeah, and you wonder if Tom Quinn maybe had some compromising photos on John Mara or something for considering how long his tenure was with the Giants and how unimpressive his special teams units were. But it's not all Quinn's fault. It's a lot of it has to do with how Jerry Reese drafted and used the back end of free agency, and that's something that Dave Gettleman has completely changed the philosophy on. He brought in Thomas McGahee, a guy who coordinated the seventh best special teams unit, according to Football Outsiders in 2017 with the Panthers, brought him in, and then he got to work in free agency. He signed Michael Thomas, the safety out of from the Miami Dolphins, who was Pro Football Focus's best special teams player in 2014, 2015, and 2017. Took one season off in 2016. He was probably still up there in the rankings. He got Cody Latimer, who actually is now competing to be the number 3 receiver, but he was also one of the best gunners in the NFL last season. Vance Joseph, his former head coach, said, if you ask me, he is the all-pro gunner in the NFL right now. Got those two. Got Teddy Williams, who's going to impact special teams. A bunch of cornerbacks like that. B.W. Webb, Curtis Riley. Guys who he looked at on special teams and saw something he liked and decided to bring them in. So he's really filled out the back end of that roster with a lot of special teams players who can help out this team right away. So I thought that was super impressive. And then if you look at the defensive scheme with James Betcher coming in, I touched on this a little bit earlier, but while it's not going to be your traditional 3-4 defensive scheme, it's going to be a one-gap scheme. But the difference with Betcher is this. What he likes to do is use his defensive alignment to attack the gaps. In some traditional 3-4 schemes, defensive linemen are mostly used to occupy blockers to free up other players. But he's going to have these defensive linemen shooting the gaps, and you can see exactly why the Giants drafted B.J. Hill and R.J. McIntosh, 2 guys who had a lot of success shooting the gaps in college as 3-technique defensive tackles who are going to fit into Betcher's scheme. So what you're going to see is a lot of blitzing, but it's going to be not the same as what we saw from Steve Spagnuolo, the former Giants coordinator, who liked to use a lot of zone blitzes, a lot of delayed zone blitzes, a lot of cornerbacks and defensive backs coming from different spots. Betcher doesn't like to do that. Betcher is going to line up against you. He's going to show you blitz, and he's going to blitz. Remember, this is a guy who finished in the top 3 in blitz percentage in his last 3 seasons, in each of his last 3 seasons as the Cardinals defensive coordinator. But what he's going to do is a lot of A-gap blitzing with inside linebackers Alec Ogletree and B.J. Goodson. Shoot guys up the gap, get one-on-one matchups on the outside for Lorenzo Carter, the rookie, and Olivier Vernon. And that's going to be the scheme with a lot of press man coverage on the outside for cornerbacks Eli Apple and Janoris Jenkins, and single high safety looks with a lot of stress on that deep safety, as Landon Collins is kind of used as more of a weapon all over the formation. So that's what you can expect, I think, from the defensive scheme this season.
Yeah, that's a very good analysis. A lot of information there. Let's talk about the culture change in the building. What differs this year from last year?
Yeah, and as you said, there has been a major culture change in the building, and that's what they wanted to do. There had to be a culture change. We all know this. Anyone who followed the team, who watched the team, who covered the team last season, knew that something had to change. There was a lot of issues in that locker room last year. And what Gettleman did this offseason was change out the team. He brought in a lot of former captains of other teams, a lot of leaders. You see a guy like Nate Solder, who wasn't even a captain of the Patriots, already making an impact from a leadership standpoint when he stays after practice the last 2 days of OTAs with Eric Flowers and stays with him and works with him on one-on-one drills as the guy, giving him more pass sets, giving him extra time to help his game. So what I really like to see from this team going forward is a unified unit that has the same goal in mind to, play the game with passion and have winning as the forefront rather than, maybe some other things that have taken the forefront in the past season under Ben McAdoo.
Okay, I'd be remiss if I didn't ask about camp battles. Everybody writes about those. You mentioned Eric Flowers. Do you think he'll be the right tackle this season?
I mean, you look at what's going on right now, the Giants' offensive tackle position, and it's easily the most worrisome position on the roster. Nate Solder, lock him in. He's in a great spot. But Giants have no depth behind Solder at either tackle spot, really. And you look at a guy like Flowers, who's lined up as the first-team right tackle in every single OTA practice since returning to the team. And why is that the case? Well, because behind him, all they have really is Nick Becton, a guy who we don't know much about, Tyler Howell, an undrafted rookie free agent from this season, who's got great size at 6'8" and 328 pounds, but he's super raw, and Chad Wheeler, a guy who they signed as an undrafted free agent out of USC last draft, who to me doesn't really look like he has the frame to play offensive tackle in the NFL, especially at the right tackle position where you need to anchor down. And while Wheeler really graded out well as a left tackle in his one lone start in Week 17 last season, he struggled in all his starts at right tackle. So I do think Flowers will have the starting job, but it will be mostly by default.
Yeah, it looks that way. Let's move on to the safety position. Landon Collins will be a strong safety, but the free safety position looks like it's wide open. It doesn't look like Darian Thompson ever really nailed that down after he got injured.
No, you're exactly right there, John. And what you have just said is exactly what we've seen transpire. In every single OTA practice, the Giants have used a heavy rotation at the safety position. Obviously, Landon Collins sideline, so that plays a role in it. But we've seen 5 different guys step up in that deep safety role, or in both safety roles. And there's a lot of stress on that deep safety position, like I touched on a little bit earlier, because the Giants are going to be using a lot more single high safety looks. And Thompson, if the Giants can get out of him what he flashed in his rookie season before breaking his foot, then he's going to win that starting job. But if he returns to the 2017 version of Thompson, then you got to look to guys like Andrew Adams, who's been with the team for a few years, former undrafted free agent safety out of UConn. Now, he's great in coverage, Adams, but his issue, to me, is very similar to what Thompson's issue is, and that's missed tackles. The Giants secondary led the NFL in missed tackles last season, and that was a big reason why the defense struggled. And if you're playing that single high safety role as the last line of defense, you got to be able to tackle in the open field. So I would say keep an eye on undrafted rookie free agent Sean Chandler out of Temple. Here's a guy who's had 4 practices with the Giants, and he's already racked up 2 interceptions. According to Pro Football Focus, he had the second highest tackling efficiency of any safety in college football who entered the draft this past draft in April. So that's a guy I'd keep an eye on for that deep safety role.
Yeah, I mean, it's still a lot of moving parts there, and we have a beat reporter, Chris Besignato, who works for the Giant Insider, who mentioned Chandler by name the other day. He said he was very impressed with him, and he thinks that he's got a good chance of making the team and maybe even getting out there, and having a significant role this year. Let's move on to slot corner. We know Eli Apple and Janoris Jenkins will probably end up being the starting outside corners, but slot corner is a big position in this league these days, and you got to have the right guy to do it. Who do you see filling that role?
Yeah, no doubt. You said it best there, John, because yesterday Shermer also made mention on his WFAN radio interview that slot cornerback is basically a starting position in today's NFL. The Giants and all teams are going to be in nickel over 60% of their snaps, and this is a battle that I think will rage on throughout camp. You want to have hope for these undrafted rookie free agents. Grant Haley out of Penn State, a kid who, by every metric, from both an athletic standpoint and a production standpoint in college, is somebody who can start in the NFL, but he's 5'9", and that's why he went undrafted. And will that impact his chances of starting? It's possible. and then a kid, Aaron Davis, who's getting a little less buzz out of Georgia. But when I spoke with our Georgia insiders at 24/7 Sports, they told me he was one of the heart and souls of that Georgia defense last year as their starting slot cornerback. Here's a kid who has the size at 6'2" and 210 pounds. And here's a guy who was name dropped by Lorenzo Carter, his former teammate, which maybe you say, okay, well, it's his former teammate. He likes the guy. But, this guy has gotten a lot of positive buzz from the people who covered Georgia. So I'd keep an eye on those two. But, William Gay, the veteran they brought in from the Steelers, who didn't play much during the 2017 season as the Steelers kind of underwent a youth movement at the cornerback position. Here's a guy who's still starting right now as the slot guy, but he's worked in a little bit with the second team. So I think the Giants are trying out different guys there. And don't forget Dante Dayon, a guy who's been with the team for several seasons now.
Yep.
Also has a similar story to Grant Haley in the fact that he's undersized at a little under 5'10". But I think those four will ultimately compete to start in the slot.
Yeah, I mean, they're going to need depth. You always need depth in the secondary. Linebackers, I'm looking at the linebackers. I really don't know what's going to happen. I think Ogletree and Goodson will be in the middle, but who's going to be at the end? Is OV going to be at one end, one outside position, and who'll be on the other end?
Yeah, so OV has made the transition to that outside linebacker position, that right outside linebacker position, in addition to a couple other players from the 2017 roster who also made the transition from defensive end to outside linebacker. And we're talking about Avery Moss, the fifth-round pick in 2017, and Romeo Okwara, the former undrafted free agent signing who got a little bit of time during the 2016 season as the starting left defensive end after JPP went down. So that's going to be your right side rotation, even though Vernon's going to play most of the snaps. Then on the left side, it's a battle I can't wait to watch in camp. Kareem Martin, the 6'6", 280-pound guy, defensive player who made the transition in 2017 from the five technique defensive end position in James Betcher's scheme to the outside linebacker position in Betcher's scheme. He's 6'6", 280, like I said, and he does an excellent job of setting the edge in the run game. Not all there as a pass rusher yet. And then we're talking about the guy I mentioned earlier, Lorenzo Carter, my favorite value pick from this draft class, who could really compete to have serious snaps this season. Here's a guy who had the fifth best pass rush productivity rating from Pro Football Focus of all outside linebackers in this draft class. He didn't always get the sacks, but I always like to say when it comes to pass rushers, people have to stop relying on the sack statistic. It's not about that. It's about total pressures, quarterback hurries, hits, and sacks combined, because those are the plays that cause an errant pass, cause an interception, cause a tip ball, all those sorts of good things. So those are the guys I keep an eye on for the outside linebacker positions.
Yeah, I mean, it's going to be an interesting battle to see who play. I think when the season starts, they're all going to get, a lot of snaps. I think it's going to be a rotation. Now, talking about rotation, you have a defensive line. It's going to be a three-man line at the core. Snacks will likely be in the middle, but who will be on the ends?
Yeah, no doubt. So on the right defensive end, which is the three tech position in Betcher's scheme, which is very similar to the position he played and started at last season with the Giants in the 4-3 scheme. We're talking about Dalvin Tomlinson. He's going to be the starter there. Now, he will rotate in and out with B.J. Hill, their rookie third-round pick, who's more NFL ready to get in there than people think, at least for a traditional third-round pick. The only reason he was really on the board at that pick is because of the position he plays. Those inside interior defensive tackles don't always come off the board early, as we've noticed. The Giants have done a great job of targeting them over the years. Linville Joseph, Dalvin Tomlinson, Jonathan Hankins, the list goes on. Yeah. But I mean, he's a guy who I think will play early on. He'll also mix in at the nose tackle position, spelling Damon Harrison, because he's got a little more pass rush chops than Harrison. So here's a guy who will probably come in on third downs at the nose. And then at the other position, it's you bring up a great point, because it's another great position battle to watch. Josh Morrow is the guy they want to start, the free agent they signed from the Cardinals at the 5-tech. But again, here's a guy who's suspended for the first 4 games for violating the PED policy. And that opens the door maybe for RJ McIntosh, their 5th-round pick, to get involved. Now, the problem for McIntosh is he's still not practicing while recovering from this thyroid condition that caused him to lose like 25 pounds during the pre-draft process. But he's hoping to be back for the mandatory minicamp. And otherwise, guys like Kerry Wynn, who've been with the roster for a while, Robert Thomas, who they're transitioning from defensive tackle to that 5-tech defensive end position. Those are the guys you're going to see compete down there.
Yeah, they've got a lot of depth there. I mean, they did a good job filling that out. And I think on defense, they've added a lot of toughness. What they didn't have last year. They didn't have toughness. I mean, they had a lot of finesse, but they rushed the passer, but never got home. with JPP with the one hand, and Vernon is a great pass rusher, but he doesn't get enough sacks. He doesn't get enough quarterback hits. So hopefully they could do that this year. Let me ask you this. One last question before we go. Who do you think is going to be the biggest surprise this season?
So my pick for the biggest surprise is actually somebody you just name dropped, and I'm talking about Olivier Vernon.
Oh,
Here's a guy who I agree has not totally lived up to his contract with the Giants for sure. Injuries have played a factor. Mm-hmm. I do believe the fact that, Steve Spagnuolo's played him on over 92% of the defensive snaps since he's got here can't help. It can't help anybody at the defensive end position to be playing that high percentage. But here's a guy who could make a similar impact, in my opinion, in 2018 to how Chandler Jones made an impact with the Arizona Cardinals in his first season in 2017. And we're talking about Chandler Jones, a guy who came over from the Patriots, joined the Cardinals and Betcher's defense, and soon became one of the NFL's leaders in both sacks and total pressures from that outside linebacker position. And the reason being is that James Betcher's defense is a matchup-based defense. What he likes to do is attack those gaps and send so many blitzers to the point where he can get one-on-one matchups for his best pass rusher. And he knows his best pass rusher is Olivier Vernon. So if Vernon sees the amount of one-on-one matchups I do believe he'll see in this new defensive scheme, I think we're going to see a brand new player who can get to the quarterback on a consistent basis. So he's probably my pick as the biggest surprise this season.
Yeah, and I agree with that because what Chris told us, our beat reporter told us, that he saw Vernon lining up outside linebacker, in a full stance, and then he had his hand in the dirt on other plays. So they're going to use him, any way they can, and there's a very good possibility that they flip-flop him from one side of the field to the next to get the matchup that they want. That's something that they haven't done in the recent past. Anyway, when the offense came out, they looked at the Giants' defense. Everybody was in the same place every play.
Exactly.
So, they have to change that up. And I think with shifting personnel, rotating personnel, and they've got a lot of depth there, I think that's going to happen this year. Now, who do you think could be the biggest disappointment or take the biggest hit this year?
Sure. If we're talking about the biggest disappointment on this roster, I will probably lean towards Eric Flowers. I hate to say for the fans who are hoping for, another possible rejuvenation now that he has Nate Solder. But for me, the issue with Flowers has always been the same thing. It's a combination of technique. His footwork is sloppy. His hand placement is even worse on the outside. And then it's a combination of, everyone who transitions from that left side to the right side after playing it their entire career has a learning period they have to go through. Chad Wheeler said it best last year. He played left tackle his entire career at USC and had a great start for the Giants, like I said, in Week 17. But his starts at right tackle last year weren't good. And I think Eric Flowers will undergo similar growing pains. And what really alarmed me most about Eric Flowers when I watched his 2017 game tape was his lack of effort in the run game. He earned his worst overall grade as a run blocker from Pro Football Focus his entire career last season. And there is some hope that maybe he was just playing through injuries. It's something Pat Shermer has mentioned throughout the offseason. But I'm just not buying it yet. I think he will end up being the biggest disappointment if I had to pick one.
All right, Dan Schneier, 24/7 Sports. Thank you for coming on, and we're certainly going to have you on again. Thanks again, Dan.
Thank you for having me, John. It was great talking Giants football with you.
Get that ball and go!